Good morning, everybody. I think I'll call us to attention. I just want to say welcome again to everyone who was here last night. Welcome back this morning. We're very much looking forward to doing the Civil War Symposium today. And for those of you who weren't here last night, welcome. My name's Dr. Warren Doctor. I don't think I said that last night. I'm the president and CEO of the East Tennessee Historical Society, and it's my job to tell you that if you're not a member, you should join, so that we can continue to have programs like this. Before we kick off and I introduce Aaron again, just a couple things I want to say. The first is, just so we all know, these are going to be recorded. These are being recorded. Last night was recorded. We do this in partnership with community media, Knoxville Community Media. So it will appear on their station, and then it will appear on YouTube. So if you miss anything, you want to go back and watch it, you can go on YouTube and find it. And also you can tell your friends to watch it on YouTube, which is always fun. The other thing is to say that this entire symposium was made possible by the Tennessee Civil War National Heritage Area grant that we received from them. They've been tremendous supporters of our work here, and we're very, very happy to have them and to partner with them, to have them be our sort of champions. So we're very, very happy to have that here. I spoke a little bit about my own view of the Civil War last night, so I won't repeat any of that this morning. But what I will repeat this morning is the introduction from my good friend Dr. Astor. He's a professor of history at Maryville College in Maryville, Tennessee. And last night when I posted stuff, just so you know, the president of the college, Aaron, was very pleased because we're also Twitter buddies.
That's good to hear.
Yeah. You're in good standing.
Help my wallet, maybe. No.
He's the author of several books, including Rebels on the Border, The Civil War, Emancipation, and Reconstruction of Kentucky and Missouri, and The Civil War along Tennessee's Cumberland Plateau. He is the co-editor of books as well, including Slavery, Interpreting American History. He's also written 11 articles for the New York Times in their Disunion series on topics such as guerrilla warfare, battles, and campaigns of Western theater. Last night it was adorable when one of his daughters asked him about guerrilla warfare and if there were actual guerrillas. I do have some thoughts about Napoleonic warfare and how that links into this with guerrilla warfare, but that's maybe a whole other lecture. He's currently working on a book project that explores the 1860 presidential election and a grassroots phenomenon from the perspective of 4 distinct American communities. Aaron earned his PhD in the history of Northwestern University in 2006 and his BA at Hamilton College in 1995. Without further ado, Aaron Astor. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sorry, I had to get out my reading glasses. I'm reaching that age. Okay, well, thank you very much. It's very exciting to see you all again. It feels like I probably should have gone to bed here, and that would have been perfectly fun. You know, kids, they run into their teacher like at the grocery store, and they're like, I never thought I'd see them outside of the classroom. Do you live here? And so I wonder if I sort of feel like that's how I am here. This is a welcome again to this Knoxville Symposium on the Fort Sanders campaign. This is, I should mention, when we had the sesquicentennial, I guess it's 10 years ago now, we did a lot of really neat programming, but we never had a chance to do something like this. So I'm really excited that now we're able to actually kind of look and explore some of the specifics of the military aspect of the campaign, but also the lives of ordinary people, various different peoples within East Tennessee and how they experienced the Civil War. So it's very, it's nice that we're able to do this now, and I once again appreciate Warren for introducing me, and Lisa, of course, again for organizing this wonderful symposium, and for the rest of the staff here for getting this all together. And thank you all again for coming out. I've seen some familiar faces from last night, and also some new faces, which is, of course, I'm very excited to see. So we are, what my task today, I think, is to try to focus on the military events of what we call generally the Knoxville campaign. What happened roughly between August of 1863 and April of 1864, with a concentration of events around November of 1863. In fact, today is actually an anniversary of one of the key battles leading up to the Battle of Fort Sanders, the Battle of Campbell Station, or as I like to call it, the Battle of the Turkey Creek Shopping Center. And And but it is but that was only one of the defensive lines upon the retreat for Burnside's men. But it's and that actually, I mean, I'm joking, but that actually is one of the challenges in Civil War history, Civil War preservation, is that many battles, they don't stay as battlefields. They often get developed over. Often very quickly, actually, and so that's a challenge as well. I'm on the board of the Tennessee Civil War Preservation Association, and we work statewide to try to preserve some of these endangered battlefields, including especially some of the smaller battlefields that are important to this particular campaign that I will be discussing. But I want to start, of course, with the main event here, which is the Battle of Fort Sanders, and this image up here, which I think depicts, you see a man, his hands up in the air at this ditch. This is a disaster. You can kind of look at it and tell, just by, if you know nothing about the Battle of Fort Sanders, you can tell something is going badly for people who are on the right-hand side of it who are stuck in the ditch. This was a product of a botched series of planning, part of a larger botched command structure in the Confederate Army that even led Longstreet to this particular spot, but also some very capable engineering on behalf of the Union command, particularly a man named Orlando Poe, who you will learn a little bit more about. It is a battle that is often forgotten, overlooked in the larger discussions of the Civil War. In fact, the Knoxville campaign in general is often overlooked for a couple of reasons. One is that it was, in essence, a sort of side part of the more strategically critical Chattanooga campaign. But it is also important for its own right. The control of the resources and the railroad through this area was important, even beyond simply its attachment to the battles of Chattanooga. So this is a story that is of larger importance beyond simply the region. Obviously, within the region, it's extremely important. This was a massively cataclysmic and disruptive event that fundamentally and permanently changed the physical landscape as well as the lives of thousands upon thousands of ordinary people. So what I want to do this chronologically, is to start off with East Tennessee essentially has two occupational periods. The first half of the war, it is under Confederate rule. Then beginning at the end of August, beginning of September of '63, it is then under Union rule. And so I want to, begin with talking about the time under Confederate rule and sort of some of the military strategy leading up to what would eventually be what we call the Knoxville campaign. Then dialing in a little bit closer to the arrival of Ambrose Burnside, the Union Army, coming into Knoxville and what that entailed and what that looked like by November. Then, of course, we have Confederate General James Longstreet, who launches this major campaign to try and recapture Knoxville and East Tennessee from Burnside, culminating, of course, in the Battle of Fort Sanders. And then perhaps the most bizarre moment of this entire campaign is what I like to call the long denouement of the Knoxville campaign, this sort of hanging out east of Knoxville, wondering how long, Longstreet, are you going to stay here? It reminds me of the end of the Ferris Bueller Days Off movie when Matthew Broderick looks in the camera and says, "Why are you still here? You're still watching?" And I sort of feel that way. Why is Longstreet still hanging around for a few months afterwards? There are a few somewhat sizable battles, and then it just seems to be waiting for his orders to return to Virginia, although there are actually, in fact, other issues going on at that point. So we will finish with there. So I want to start off, some of this stuff, this is mostly different than what I did last night, but there'll be a few images that are repeats, including this one, to talk a little bit about the geography. You can't really understand the Knoxville campaign and anything militarily around here without appreciating the topography, without appreciating the geography of East Tennessee. This is a region that is defined by a valley that goes from northeast to southwest. It is traveling up and down the valley is not particularly hard, except for the fact that you have lots of ridges in between. You have rivers and creeks that go at seemingly erratic directions. You have hills that you may not know what is on the other side of. You have a railroad that does go all the way through, but it has to, of course, include bridges that are in various states of disrepair, sometimes deliberate, sometimes not, throughout this entire campaign. But just as important as this northeast to southwest axis of the geography of East Tennessee is the transverse, the way to get through or into the valley from particularly the northwest. And thus would be the gaps in particularly the Cumberland Mountain. And by far the most important gap that anybody understood at the time was Cumberland Gap. And this is not advancing. Oops, let's see. This is not advancing. This is not on. I'm trying to advance this slide here. It is not moving. Let me try to put this back in again. I think this might be frozen. Mason? I think the computer is actually frozen. I think it will not actually move. So you want to? Not sure what's going on here. I mean, it's literally the actual thing won't move, but.
It would be a good Civil War conference if we didn't have.
Some sort of technical. Well, I can at least talk while we're trying to fix this here. To point out a bit about the. Oh, there we go. Got it now.
Yeah, I think you may have to, and then just press it like.
Okay. So can I use this or?
Try. I don't know.
Let's see.
See.
Oh, there we go. We got it. This was just. I think we just had to put some. All right. Thank you. That was easy. That was as easy as the Union defense of Fort Sanders. All right. And thankfully, a lot less blood spilled. Okay. So back here to East Tennessee. And again, the importance of the gaps in the mountains. Let me go back to this again. The most important gap is, of course, Cumberland Gap, which is right there, the junction of Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee. It is, as I like to say, it's the greatest battle that never happened. There were some small battles around there. In the late 18th and early 19th century, it was the main passageway for huge numbers of people to travel into the west, the Wilderness Road, Daniel Boone's Wilderness Road, into Kentucky and beyond. In the Civil War, it was setting up as a main entrance point from north to south. And but so much so, it was like a Thermopylae that it was a death trap, as both armies understood. And so, as you'll see, when both armies would go from Kentucky into Tennessee, they would travel Interstate 75, as we all do. But they would actually travel roads or paths that are actually more similar to where Interstate 75 and I-25W goes, rather than the 25E through Cumberland Gap, because it was going to be such a death trap. Mastery of these gaps through the mountains would prove to be extremely important for both sides. Now, the other thing, of course, to mention here, our key point is the divided loyalties of the region. As we talked about last night, this was a primarily pro-Union area. However, there are some key Confederate exceptions. Those tended to be among communities living along the railroads that connected East Tennessee to Georgia, the Carolinas, and to Virginia. Grain millers, there was a vision of setting East Tennessee up as a breadbasket for the rest of the South via railroads. People like J.G.M. Ramsey were investors in these railroads, connecting East Tennessee into the rest of the South. That railroad was not finished until 1858, and so there was not a whole lot of time for the region to sort of reorient itself around this railroad, and so only a small minority of people would be connected to it. It is not a purely economic connection. I mean, that's there at its core, but there are also social connections, news traveling along these railroads that brings you very almost different realities for those who are railroad-based and become pro-Confederate versus the majority of people who are not along that railroad. Some communities, like, for example, Sweetwater, the home of General John Vaughn, whose picture that is on the left there, would be a prominent East Tennessee Confederate. And not surprisingly, are coming out of these particular communities. On the bottom right is a map of these railroads. One other thing that's important about the railroad through East Tennessee is that it is a common gauge all the way through. The color green making its way all the way from Richmond to Lynchburg, Virginia, down through Bristol, then, of course, through Knoxville, going down towards, actually east of Chattanooga, down to Dalton, Georgia, and beyond. That is of huge importance for the Confederacy militarily. There's also, of course, a telegraph line that's going to follow it. The other railroad connection to the rest of the South, of course, would be due south to Petersburg and then to North Carolina. That railroad was much less reliable. There were several different gauges. There were rivers where there were no bridges or very poorly constructed bridges. So this was, in many ways, the Achilles heel of the Confederacy from a military standpoint. Richmond's link to the Western Theater went right through the heart of heavily Unionist East Tennessee, making it a prime target for saboteurs for this Unionist population here, but also something that needed to be guarded. I mean, that's why it's strategically significant of its own right. In terms of gauging the loyalties of the region, in 1861, there were, in fact, 2 referenda held in that year, in February and in June. In February, overwhelmingly, Tennesseans voted to send Unionists to a convention, but they also actually voted a majority not to even hold this convention at all. Governor Isham Harris, who was quite militantly pro-secession, there was even the joke that Tennessee didn't secede, Isham Harris seceded and took Tennessee with him. That may have been the case early on. Even Middle Tennessee still hoped to stay loyal to the Union. Everything changed, though, of course, in April, with the firing on Fort Sumter, and very importantly, Lincoln calling up 75,000 troops to put down this rebellion. And a point I mentioned last night, and I always like to reinforce to my students, is that while 3 million people roughly fought in the Civil War as a whole, in 1860 there were only about 16,000 people in the entire United States Army, and roughly half or just under half of them, of course, left and joined this new Confederacy. So the armies on both sides coming into the war were rather tiny. They would have to raise regiments using volunteer militia in the various states. Both sides would have to do this, and then they would form companies and regiments. Importantly, and people forget this, they elected their captains of companies, and they elected the colonels of their regiments. In fact, quite often there would be somebody who was a pre-war leader of a community or even a factory in Cincinnati or something like that, who would say, I'm going to form a company, and would bring his employees along. There was even a professor at what eventually became a college in Clarksville, Tennessee, eventually what became Rhodes College when it moved to Memphis, who brought along many of his students to join. No, I'm not going to do that. So, but who brought many of his students along to form a military company. This was fairly common. You had pre-war groups of people that would join together into enlistment camps. But you had this going on in the North in places like Ohio, and you had it going on here in Tennessee. But when this second referendum happens, in June of 61, at this point, Middle Tennessee now goes almost entirely towards supporting the Confederacy, which they see as sort of a fait accompli at that point. Essentially, they argue that if we have to go, we want to avoid war, but if we have to go to war, we will fight alongside our fellow Southerners. But East Tennessee, while some did shift over towards the secessionist direction, the majority remained in the pro-Union camp. And as I talked about last night, a complex of issues, resentment at sort of loss of power to Middle Tennessee, relative lack of importance of slavery and the slave-based economy, a vigorous two-party system, including the powerful Whig Party, and some very important leaders, not only from the Whigs, but particularly from Democrats like Andrew Johnson, all helped to solidify East Tennessee as a relative Unionist stronghold. Not everybody. It's very important. There were certainly some very important Confederate supporters as well. But East Tennessee developed and deservedly earned its reputation as a fairly strongly Unionist region. In contrast with Western North Carolina, for example, which was actually quite a bit more pro-Confederate. Okay, so enough of that. So when the war begins, there is this referendum in June. Tennessee is now officially seceding from the Union. In East Tennessee, there is call for, the Unionists have not accepted this new reality and have applied for the right to form a new state, essentially what West Virginia was doing. West Virginia, by the way, had a very strange way of being formed. They actually created a fake new state of Virginia called the Restored Government of Virginia and used that to authorize the creation of the new state of West Virginia. That restored government, I shouldn't call it fake, it eventually became the basis for Reconstruction of Virginia later on. East Tennessee appealed, per the Constitution, appealed to the Governor Isham Harris to be allowed to form another state. Of course, he said, yeah, right. No, you're not going to do that. And then they started planning eventually for a military uprising, including burning bridges. But in the meantime, it was well understood that East Tennesseans were in a foul mood about this whole situation. And to the credit of the military and political leadership within Tennessee, they realized that East Tennessee must be treated carefully, and deliberately sent over a man who himself had been a very reluctant Confederate, although from Middle Tennessee, named Felix Zollicoffer, who had been an editor from Middle Tennessee and was one of the many people who had really, really hoped as long as possible to keep Tennessee in the Union, but then, along with much of Middle Tennessee, shifted over to Confederate support once the war began. He was placed in charge in East Tennessee and deliberately treated the area with a semblance of leniency. He even allowed Parson Brownlow to continue to publish his publication. He basically said, we're not going to allow for any kind of armed resistance or armed insurrection against Confederate rule, but we're not necessarily going to crack down on free speech. If you want to call yourself neutral, that'll be okay. We're not going to force you into the army. Some people certainly appreciated this, but the reality is it was never going to be enough. And the region would ultimately say, no, we actually do not want to be under Confederate control at all. And there would be an uprising, and Zollicoffer's lenient approach would be replaced by a much harsher one. Meanwhile, the bigger question, actually, I should go ahead here. As I mentioned before, the East Tennessee Unionists developed a rather elaborate plot to burn the bridges along that key railroad through East Tennessee. There are 9 of them. And on November the 8th of 1861, they did in fact burn 5 of them. The others, they could not. There was, for a variety of reasons. They had hoped to get Unionist military support to back this particular effort. But at the last minute, the Union command, including Don Carlos Buell and William Tecumseh Sherman, decided, probably rightly, militarily, it did not make sense to come into East Tennessee in order to support this effort. This is the rainy season. This is the mud season. These roads are, even today, the roads can fall apart in bad weather. You can only imagine what it would have been like back in the 1860s. But it did raise a question of how exactly the Union Army was going to make its way into Tennessee. And there was a lot of debate amongst commanders in the West about what would be the best approach. We have to remember that Kentucky had first tried to go neutral. When the war broke out, there were 4 slave states that had not joined the Confederacy, not officially: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. And each of those border states kind of went a different path. Missouri sort of devolved into guerrilla war and chaos. Maryland was mostly put under military rule because, after all, it surrounds Washington, D.C. Delaware never seriously threatened any kind of secession at all. But Kentucky its legislature was very pro-Union, talking up its relationships with its cousins, its residents' cousins across the river in Indiana and Illinois and Ohio, many of whom were Kentuckians themselves, including like an Abraham Lincoln. He was certainly not alone in that. But there were the governor, Beriah Magoffin, was more sympathetic to the South. And the conclusion amongst Kentuckians was it's best to stay out of this whole affair. And on May the 20th of 1861, Kentucky declared itself to be neutral, after which one commenter quipped that before there was one country and now there is 3, the United States, the Confederate States, and Kentucky. It's not still that way. But anyway, this lasted, but through the summer, this neutrality came under pressure. There would be efforts by both sides to recruit people against the rules of this, but the sentiment was still clearly, once the immediate rush of the spring passed, by late summer, or by middle of the summer, sentiment had swung back towards the Union side. And then in one of the early blunders on the Confederate side, invaded Kentucky, knowing that if they did that, it would force Kentucky to side itself with the Union. Now, it's important to think about why they did this. At this point, Gideon Pillow, who was in charge of the Tennessee State Militia, and then began the process of creating what was called the Provisional Army of Tennessee, and then the Army of Tennessee, he was, of course, worried and thinking about how the Union Army would come to invade Tennessee. And the thinking was that the most likely way would be the Mississippi River landing at Memphis. And so Gideon Pillow's first effort was to make sure to secure the Mississippi River as best as possible. This meant in particular a series of bluffs just north of the Tennessee border around Columbus, Kentucky, and Belmont, Missouri. This, of course, would require invading Kentucky in order to secure these bluffs. Knowing that this might throw Kentucky onto the Union side, Leonidas Polk and Gideon Pillow decided it was worth it. And so at the beginning of September of 61, they did in fact invade this area of the far western part of Kentucky. Not surprisingly, Kentucky's legislature immediately said, "Get out." And a day later, a relatively unknown Union general hanging out in Cairo, Illinois, moved over to enter Paducah, Kentucky. This general's name was Ulysses S. Grant. And he entered Kentucky shortly after the Confederates did. And the Kentucky legislature informed Polk and the Confederates that they're the ones who have to leave and Grant could stay. It was clear that Kentucky's days of neutrality were over, and it was now officially throwing its lot in with the Union. There were still some concerns about emancipation policy. They wanted to maintain themselves as pro-slavery and pro-union, but those concerns were dealt with over the course of the next couple of weeks, and Kentucky thus was now a Union state. The border of Tennessee and Kentucky was now, for all intents and purposes, an international boundary between the United States of America and the Confederate States of America. But this still left the question, this is all in September, by the way, this still left the question of how would the Union Army, now based in Kentucky proper, enter the state of Tennessee. Would it go through the east, which is what the East Tennessee Unionists had hoped? And here was this great plan organized way up the Union command, including to Lincoln himself, and certainly to Andrew Johnson, to support this bridge-burning sabotage operation. But that would involve entering in the late fall, the rainy, muddy roads of East Tennessee and potentially getting trapped there. This had a lot of symbolic appeal. There was a lot of, Lincoln personally called for saving these poor East Tennessee mountaineers who we knew were very loyal to the Union. But militarily, it might not have made as much sense as to go through the middle or the western part of the state. So the decision was to go to the middle and the western part of the state, much to the chagrin of the bridge burners, who would be they would only burn some of the bridges, but they would then be captured, arrested, and a major crackdown driving many East Tennesseans to Kentucky. But the question at this point was where in Middle Tennessee, particularly, would the Union Army actually invade? Would it go from Bowling Green via the railroad, the relatively recently finished Louisville-Nashville Railroad, right to Nashville? Would it take a series of turnpikes on down there? Or would it follow the rivers, the twin rivers of the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, over where Land Between the Lakes is now, and try to make its way that way? Newly installed in command of all Confederate forces in the West, Albert Sidney Johnston guessed incorrectly. He thought that the invasion would come via Bowling Green and was thus relatively unprepared for an amphibious campaign in the West over the Tennessee and the Cumberland rivers. By the beginning of February of 1862, Ulysses Grant and the Navy under Admiral Foote had gone down the Tennessee River and captured Fort Henry, which straddles the line of Tennessee and Kentucky. There's also Fort Hyman right across the river. By this point, this fort was practically underwater. It was a very poorly constructed fort, and this is not good. Like I said, the weather's not good to invade in the wintertime here. And capturing Fort Henry on February the 6th of 1862 allowed Union gunboats to continue to penetrate deeper into the South, all the way down even as far as into Alabama, which was a major sign. In fact, there were a lot of Unionists living along that river, heading down the Tennessee River and even into North Alabama. What's often considered more important is what happens over the next 10 days of trying to use the Navy, though failing to take a more formidable fort on the Cumberland River called Fort Donelson. This fort was not able to be taken by naval methods, but instead Grant and Baldy Smith sending military infantry across that spit of land and surrounding Confederate forces at Fort Donelson. There was a chance for them to break out, but then for reasons that are still not quite understood, Gideon Pillow and John Floyd both decided to go back into their trenches, where of course they would then be just captured the next day. Floyd and Pillow abandoned their commands, and it fell to the third in command, Simon Bolivar Buckner, who was a former friend of Ulysses Grant and hoped that he would get better terms of surrender. And Grant, of course, made his name famous at this point, saying there shall be no terms except for unconditional surrender. And this meant that over 12,000 Confederate troops would be boarding boats to prison camps in the North, and instead of simply being paroled and sent back home. It also, of course, opened up the Cumberland River for the capture first of Clarksville and then, most importantly, Nashville. And it allowed for further penetration of the Union Army down into the heart of West and Middle Tennessee. A campaign that would go for the next few weeks. Nashville will be captured in late February of 1862. When you think about this, the state of Tennessee does not really officially secede until June 8th of 1861. Its capital is retaken just 8 months later, or 8.5 months later at the end of February of 1862. But importantly, Middle and West Tennessee are, by and large, very pro-Confederate, and they're now under Union control. East Tennessee is remaining under Confederate control, even though its population is primarily pro-Union. So there's a great state of discontent across the entire state. This campaign down into lower West Tennessee, the next step of it was going to be to capture a key railroad junction at Corinth, Mississippi, and with Grant heading straight down the Tennessee River, and Don Carlos Buell and his forces coming down to take Nashville, coming down to join Grant around Savannah, Tennessee. And Albert Sidney Johnston realized here was an opportunity to bag Grant, if he could, before Buell could come to his aid. And rushing his troops around to Corinth and then heading up into the swampy land of around the Tennessee River Bend, along where Mississippi and Alabama and Tennessee all meet, engaged Grant's forces around a church called Shiloh, and thus began the bloodiest battle in all of American history up to that point. In fact, bloodier than every war of American history up to that point, on April the 6th and April the 7th. Grant was nearly defeated in this battle. Johnston, however, was killed in this battle. Buell came in the middle of the night at Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River and was able to force a counterattack, and the Union was able to hold the field at Shiloh. The Union Army then pushed ever so slowly across those swampy areas down to Corinth, now under the command of Henry Halleck, who was not exactly a swift-footed commander, and eventually, after besieging Corinth, grabbed this key railroad junction, which allowed for the city of Memphis to fall to the Union Army, especially after a key island number 10 above it, had been taken. And now Middle and West Tennessee was firmly in Union hands. The Confederacy was facing a moment of crisis here. It had retreated further south to Tupelo, Mississippi, and Braxton Bragg was now placed in command. And probably one of his best moments, he was able to reorganize this Army of Tennessee and use the rails to travel all the way down to the Gulf Coast and back up again, rebuilding the morale, rebuilding the forces themselves. A lot of these have been in the Army for a year at this point, so they had to reorganize a second wave of enlistments, and then returned around Chattanooga and began thinking about a counterattack, not only into Tennessee again, but even all the way into Kentucky. This would be simultaneous with Robert E. Lee's northward attack leading to the Battle of Antietam in Maryland. These were twin sort of assaults from the middle of 1862 going into the border states, at least, Kentucky and Maryland. This would be a two-pronged attack, where E. Kirby Smith, who was at this point in command of Confederate forces out of Knoxville, would push straight up north, and this would actually follow pretty much the path of Interstate 75 up towards Lexington, a smaller force, and the Confederate forces under Bragg, the much larger one, would head out of Chattanooga and head in a diagonal direction over the plateau over to here around Sparta, threatening Nashville, but bypassing it, going all the way up, heading up towards even Louisville, Kentucky. Don Carlos Buell, who was in charge of Nashville, did not know what Bragg's intentions were, but then figured out that Kentucky was, in fact, the goal, and even Louisville was the goal. And so raced back as quickly as he could, tried to stop Bragg, confronted him at Munfordville and a few other places, didn't defeat Bragg, but was able to slow him down a bit, and was able to secure Louisville. At the same time, E. Kirby Smith, after annihilating a home guard force at Richmond, Kentucky, captured Lexington, and even threatened the city of Cincinnati, Ohio. This caused a great deal of panic across the Midwest. But the forces of Kirby Smith and Bragg were never able to negotiate, never able to coordinate very well together. And eventually, Bragg's men ran into Buell's men outside of Danville, a place called Perryville. And this was actually right after they even briefly occupied Frankfort to basically install a Confederate governor of Kentucky, and about 5 minutes later they left. The purpose actually was serious. It was to try to institute a draft for Kentucky. And Bragg was disappointed at this whole campaign. Kirby Smith was filled with lots of people who had been, generally known as the orphans. They were Kentuckians who joined the Confederacy and they could not go home again. They thought they could redeem Kentucky. They thought that legions of Kentuckians would join them in the Confederate war effort. That just didn't happen. There was a small group, and Bragg basically cut his losses and says, look, we got supplies here. That's about it. There was no general uprising. Most Kentuckians did not want to fight, frankly, for either side. That's how things ended up going. This battle at Perryville was terribly bloody. It was mostly a draw, as many of these battles were, but Bragg held the field, but then decided at that point there was no point in sticking around. He finally met up with Kirby Smith afterwards at the town of Harrodsburg and then agreed to retreat back to Tennessee again. And so they went southeastwardly down to Cumberland Gap, through Cumberland Gap, down to Knoxville, and then rode the rails from Knoxville down to Chattanooga, and then went up northwestwardly to Murfreesboro, figuring that they would hang out there for the rest of the winter. But that was not to be. The Union Army was able to push the Confederates out of Kentucky, but they were longing for some kind of military victory, especially as the new year approached. There is a political significance to this because the Emancipation Proclamation is going to take effect on January 1st. Just as the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation was issued right after a victory at Antietam, the thinking was Lincoln wanted to issue the full Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st after a Union victory. And there had been two disasters before that. A not as well-known disaster at Chickasaw Bayou along the Mississippi River with Sherman, but a much more famous and in some ways an interesting foreshadowing defeat for the Union Army at Fredericksburg. And I mention that foreshadowing because by this point the Union Army in command was under the command of Ambrose Burnside. And the Confederate commander at the top of Marye's Heights behind a stone wall mowing down Burnside's forces was James Longstreet. These two would meet again a year later right here in Knoxville. This battle, a disaster, had convinced that basically meant the Union needed to find some way to have a victory, and Buell was replaced by William Stark Rosecrans, and he led forces out of Nashville and attacked the Bragg's men along the Stones River in Murfreesboro on New Year's Eve. This battle was very bloody. It was very, very the Union was almost annihilated here. They was so bad they actually took a day off on New Year's Day and then finished the fighting the next day, where Mendenhall's batteries on the Union side was able to annihilate Breckinridge and several other Confederates who were trying to cross Stones River and forced Bragg to retreat to the southeast. And this really sets up things for the rest of 1863. The Union Army is now in command of Middle and West Tennessee. It is in command of Murfreesboro. It is in command of Nashville. It is in command of everything to the west of there. It is not in command of anything east of there. Okay, and meanwhile, to the east, those bridge burners, this crackdown in the east led all sorts of people to Kentucky. This map, which sort of illustrates where control was in 1863, is, I think, a map of discontent. The sort of northwest of that line is the Union control of Nashville. I'm not sure why it dips up. I think there was briefly some Confederate protrusion under Forrest whenever this map was exactly supposed to represent. But essentially, Middle and West Tennessee is under Union control, and East Tennessee is under Confederate control, despite the desires of the civilians. Okay, so now we set up for what's going to be this campaign here in Knoxville. In the spring of 1863, the Union Army is planning two major efforts in the Western Theater. The much more famous one, the larger one, is to capture Vicksburg along the Mississippi River, and that is going to engage Ulysses Grant for several months, ultimately leading to a siege and its capture on July the 4th. In the Eastern Theater, the Union Army is busy at this point fending off a major Confederate invasion of the North culminating in the Battle of Gettysburg. But in the middle was this other hugely important strategic effort by the Union command under Rosecrans to take the city of Chattanooga. Now, why was Chattanooga so important? Chattanooga is the funnel of the universe. It was the gateway to the Deep South. Chattanooga is where rivers and turnpikes and railroads all converge there, north, south, east, and west. It is not a terribly difficult city to capture. It is sitting in a bowl surrounded by mountains on all sides, but it is a very difficult city to hold because it can be very easily cut off from the outside world. And Chattanooga was widely understood by both sides to be one of the key targets to hold for the foregoing time. And so the question on the Union side was, how exactly are you going to get to Chattanooga? And Rosecrans's Army of the Cumberland, as it was now called, began its campaign in June to a campaign of maneuver its way down towards Chattanooga, and actually a rather brilliant use of the landscape, the gaps around Hoover's Gap. Sort of, again, if you drive Interstate 24 going from Murfreesboro southeast towards Chattanooga, you will drive right through this terrain here. Using the gaps to shield his movements and threatening Bragg with constant outflanking, Bragg simply lost his nerve and lost any sense of feeling that he had control of the situation, retreated as far. We had already retreated to the Duck River after Murfreesboro, but now he starts retreating closer and closer to Chattanooga. And then Bragg makes a very, very critical decision here. He realizes that there's no way he can stop Rosecrans. He does not have any confidence that he knows exactly where Rosecrans is coming from. You also have to realize that Bragg has a terrible set of relationships with his subordinates, all of whom thoroughly despise him and distrust him, and he distrusts all of them. And this very poisonous set of relationships is going to affect the Confederate ability to engage in any kind of military action, especially over a larger geographic scope. So Bragg decides, as we get into August of 1863, that he is going to retreat out of, he's not only going to pull southeast towards Chattanooga, but he's actually going to pull out of Chattanooga itself. And if he does that, of course, that exposes those Confederate troops that are now under the control of Simon Bolivar Buckner in Knoxville. And he realizes that there's no way they could fight off any potential Union invasion by themselves, and so orders Buckner to also retreat, out of Knoxville and into Georgia. The plan here, of course, is for Bragg to consolidate as much Confederate force as possible onto terrain more to his choosing. And that is going to be along a creek called Chickamauga Creek, just south of Chattanooga, on the very northern extreme of Georgia. Bragg pulls all of his men out of Chattanooga. He is joined by over 10,000 men from Buckner coming down from Knoxville, and he's going to call up a third major group of soldiers from James Longstreet, who, after having just fought the Battle of Gettysburg, are now, and are thus very much battle-hardened, are going to take the rails all the way down to join Bragg along Chickamauga Creek, and maybe even catch Rosecrans as he gets trapped in these gaps as he's trying to make his way across the Cumberlands, across Lookout Mountain, and eventually towards Chickamauga Creek. Now, before this, though, it's important to mention that there was a sign of just how difficult the situation was for Confederate control of East Tennessee, including Knoxville. William Sanders, who was a cavalry general, was actually a Southerner, but who ended up fighting for the Union side, had launched a major cavalry raid in June of 1863 and burned several bridges and, of course, electrified the Unionist population, who now felt for the first time that their deliverance was near. This was a raid. It was not an actual invasion, but this often happens before you have a major infantry invasion. There was a plan. This clearly sent a sign that the Union Army was soon going to enter into the Knoxville area, joining the Rosecrans's efforts at Tullahoma heading towards Chattanooga. And in fact, that's exactly what was happening. The Union Army was now beginning its plans for an invasion of Knoxville to coincide with the invasion of Chattanooga. And Ambrose Burnside, who had done so poorly at Fredericksburg, and who led his men on a mud march after that disastrous battle in December, was, as often happened when commanders fail in the East, they are exiled to the West to maybe try and redeem themselves. And this is what happened with Burnside. He and the Ninth Corps were sent out to first to Ohio and then into Kentucky to begin preparations for a major invasion of Knoxville and East Tennessee. They gathered at a camp that there was a camp nearby called Camp Dick Robinson, but they built a bigger camp nearby called Camp Nelson, named for Bull Nelson, who had actually been shot in a duel by a fellow Union general named Jefferson C. Davis. Yes, a different Jefferson Davis at the Galt House Hotel in Louisville, Kentucky. Camp Nelson, both of these guys were quite ornery, by the way, Bull Nelson and Jefferson C. Davis. But anyway, Burnside is now preparing for this large-scale invasion. And who is going to be involved in this invasion? This is generally known as the Department of the Ohio. It includes the Ninth Corps coming from the east, and most of the units from the Ninth Corps are in fact regiments from the east. Now, Earl Hess's, this is sort of the Bible of the Knoxville campaign, but Earl Hess's book has the orders of battle, and just to give you a sense of the geography of who these people are, the Ninth Corps is going to include regiments from Massachusetts, New York, the 36th Massachusetts, 79th New York, 45th Pennsylvania, 29th Massachusetts, 46th New York, 50th Pennsylvania, and then there are some Michigan ones. I don't know, I guess Michigan is considered the east here. Rhode Island, Maryland, and New Hampshire. The point is these are Northeasterners, okay? These are generally, this is the Ninth Corps. This is part of being transferred west from the Northeast. But that's not enough. That's not all that Burnside is going to have as command. He's also going to cobble together various other forces into what is going to be called the 23rd Corps. And the 23rd Corps is also going to meet there. And to give you a sense of the different origins of these folks in the 23rd Corps, placed under the command of Brigadier General Mullen Manson. I always want to say Marilyn Manson, but I swear it's not. It's Mullen Manson. There is 107th Illinois, 13th Kentucky, 23rd, more Michiganders, 111th Ohio, more Ohioans, a bunch of Ohioans, Illinoisans, Kentuckians, Indianans, and some East Tennessee Unionists. In other words, the West. The 23rd Corps is going to be primarily, along with cavalry, under Shackelford, James Shackelford, and then Sanders and Frank Wolford, very famously from Kentucky. They are going to be joining this 23rd Corps. So the one thing to keep in mind about these two corps that are going to be involved in this Knoxville campaign is that by and large, the 9th Corps are men coming from the Northeast, and by and large, the 23rd Corps are men who are coming from the Midwest. It's not 100%, but that's largely who it is. And these are some of the forces that are coming down with Burnside, and off they go. In August of 1863, Buckner gets his orders that you need to leave. This is written later on, but it describes Bragg's efforts where he says, the advance of Burnside with a heavy force from Kentucky upon East Tennessee at the same time that Rosecrans moves upon Bridgeport, Alabama, induced General Buckner to draw his forces, except those at Cumberland Gap. Okay, he does keep a force at Cumberland Gap, a small one, to Loudon, Tennessee. And at that time, it was utterly impossible for me to assist him from here. Before the arrival of reinforcements from Mississippi, he was threatened in the front with while a move made to cut his connections in this direction. Unable to sustain him with a sufficient force, I ordered his command to fall back to the Hiwassee River, where it is supporting distance, and eventually they would join Bragg down along Chickamauga Creek in Georgia. These dispositions were not made without great regret and reluctance, but the force disposable rendered it impossible to hold a line extending so many hundreds of miles assailable at any point. Yeah, I mean, it's clearly this was Buckner was vulnerable. There was a small force still held at Cumberland Gap that was such a critical junction, and there's not something any force wanted to give up very easily. But nevertheless, Buckner's men pulled out of Knoxville and led to really this change in sentiment, change in command here. Burnside would arrive on September the 3rd. How did Burnside reach Knoxville? If you look at this map here, you'll notice there is that one line going to the bottom, diagonal to the bottom right, heading to Cumberland Gap. That is not, in fact, the way they enter into Knoxville, because it is still guarded by Confederate and Fraser and a few Confederate units. And so the thinking is that might be contested. Instead, there are several gaps over the Cumberlands, including into Scott County and Campbell County. Much of the main drive went through Chitwood and Huntsville in Scott County, and then joining together at Montgomery, which is in Morgan County. It's now, it's not really a town anymore, but Wartburg is now the county seat of Morgan County, but Old Montgomery was the county seat. And then pushing down towards Kingston, where the Union Army had now, and which included infantry and cavalry, had now reached the bend of the Tennessee River there, and then turned eastwardly, or east-northeast, I guess, into Knoxville itself, where Burnside was treated by the Unionist civilians as a hero. Confederates, of course, panicked, many of them left. And Burnside was thus faced with a question of how to guard his newly gained territory of East Tennessee. Cumberland Gap, remember, was the Confederates held on to it, and so it would require a little bit extra effort in order to force the Confederates out of there. They weren't sure, the Confederates there weren't sure if they should give it up so easily. Eventually, DeCourcy coming down from Kentucky and Shackelford coming up from Knoxville squeezed in upon Cumberland Gap and forced the Confederates there. They were not able to get out. In fact, they were surrendered and sent on to prison camps in Chicago. Someone was here last night who has ancestors who were involved in that, sent up to Camp Douglas. So now at this point, Cumberland Gap is now under Union control, where it would stay under Union control. And East Tennessee, there is a larger zone of occupation here. The core of it, of course, is Knoxville. But how far south does it go and how far east does it go? This is where it gets confusing, because I think we have a good grasp of Union control of Knoxville. And we have a good grasp of, the road from Knoxville down to Chattanooga, and you can only go so far before perhaps you might run into outside of a zone of control. But in the easterly direction, it's a little more confusing, because if you go east enough, you're following the East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad, which is still very much under Confederate control, and the Confederacy is not willing to give that up at all. And so as far as around Greenville, the Bulls Gap area, the Confederates are still holding on to that. And they're going to, as best they can, try to harass Union forces under Burnside. Certainly they do not want to give up control over that railroad. Very importantly, northeast of there, right into Virginia, is Saltville, the home of the Salt Works, which is of huge importance for the Confederacy too. So anyway, we have here a point where Burnside is in control of Knoxville. He has sent General Orlando Wilcox to take control at Cumberland Gap, and very importantly, to establish a supply line that can go up to Camp Nelson in Kentucky. A supply line that would go essentially along Daniel Boone's old Wilderness Road for the most part. I don't think it was exactly that, but it was close to it. Going from Nicholasville along the Kentucky River in Jessamine County, southern Jessamine County, Kentucky, down to Cumberland Gap, and then the supply line would take you down to Knoxville. This is a vulnerable supply line for sure, but it is the only way out of the valley to the north that Burnside's men could be fed. Otherwise, they're going to be living off the land, and this was not going to be very easy, to say the least. But this was the campaign as they had it. There was an effort way to the east at Blue Springs by Confederates to try to force the way into this occupation zone, but that did not make the difference. The real story at this point was what happened south of Chattanooga at the Battle of Chickamauga. Battle of Chickamauga, where you had a massive array of forces on both sides. The first day of battle was mostly inconclusive, and on the second day, in one of the most serendipitous moments of the war for the Confederacy, James Longstreet's men, who had been traveling all the way down from Virginia and then up by rail to reach the battlefield, they reached the woods of the battlefield at the exact moment when a terrible mistake happened on Union command, opening a gap in Union lines, at which Longstreet's men simply penetrated that gap and forced the Union Army from the field, leading to a rout. Only the heroic defense of Snodgrass Hill by George Thomas staved off complete annihilation of the Union Army of the Cumberland and allowed the Union Army to limp its way back into Chattanooga. This was certainly a disaster for Rosecrans. He had simply lost his nerve. He had not slept for probably 48 hours, and it showed. And he would be eventually replaced by George Thomas, head of the Army of the Cumberland. The Union Army retreated into Chattanooga, and Bragg followed suit, although a little gingerly, because he wasn't sure exactly how to really close this off. but eventually would lay siege or try to lay siege to Union forces in Chattanooga, setting up along Missionary Ridge to the east and Lookout Mountain to the south. There would be very tenuous supply into the Union forces of Chattanooga. Other than that, it would have to go a very circuitous route to the north and over the plateau to the west in order to reach any friendly Union territory. All the while, Bragg would send Confederate Cavalry General Joe Wheeler to try to capture a lot of Union supply lines, particularly over in the Sequatchie Valley. Unfortunately, Joe Wheeler, and this is not the last time it would happen, had very little control of the discipline of his men. They would, for example, raid whole stores of liquor, and then they would sample it. And then they lost all control, and this happened numerous times. But it nevertheless was quite harassing for the Union forces in Chattanooga. Then Ulysses Grant, who was victorious at Vicksburg, was placed in command of all the forces here at Chattanooga and began thinking of a way to reopen this great supply line into Chattanooga. This was the main story. Knoxville was under Burnside's control, but now there was a question of whether perhaps Burnside is the one who could come down to Chattanooga and relieve Grant and Thomas and the Army of the Cumberland that is being besieged there. This is a lot of the thinking here that is going on. And Braxton Bragg, in order to stave that off, actually sends Carter Stevenson and several units under him up to towards Knoxville to, at the very least, to probe the southwestern edges of Union control around Knoxville, and if possible, to even force Burnside away, thinking that Burnside could eventually relieve Grant, come to Grant's relief in Chattanooga. And at one point even defeats a sizable force of cavalry at Philadelphia, Tennessee, forcing the Union command north of the Tennessee River, north of Loudon, and basically to stop around Lenore Station. This would be, for the next several weeks, would be the sort of southerly border boundary of Union control, was around this sort of the Tennessee River itself. At the same time, there were continued probes on the northeasterly direction. Attacks at Blue Springs near Greenville and Bluntville up in the further northeast, all of which were relatively inconclusive, at least strategically inconclusive, and never seriously threatened Burnside's realm of control. The attack at Philadelphia was more important because it forced the Union command, it meant you're not coming to Grant's aid anytime soon, unless you really redouble your efforts, and Burnside thus had to shift north of the Tennessee River, north of Loudon, around Lenore Station. Okay, so here we have a situation where it's clear that the Union is in control of Knoxville, but it's perilous, and it's probably going to be attacked again. Carter Stevenson had, and the people under him, including George Dibble, had, certainly threatened the Union occupation of Knoxville, and Burnside got an engineer, Orlando Poe, to get to work to build fortifications around the city of Knoxville. Now, these fortifications, many of them had already been started under Confederate control, but were now dramatically improved by Orlando Poe, and it turned Knoxville into one of the most heavily fortified cities in the entire country. Washington, D.C., of course, would be the most fortified. Nashville would be heavily fortified. But Knoxville, for the time being, would now be very, very well fortified on both sides of the Tennessee River. And I should mention, by the way, it was still called the Holston River at that point. The Holston was considered to go all the way up to the French Broad then, not like today, where it's the Little Tennessee is where the Tennessee starts. So along the Holston River, on both sides of the Holston River, Orlando Poe and his men got to work, and I say his men, a lot of them were actually recently freed African Americans who helped to build many of these forts along on both sides of the river in preparation for an eventual invasion, whether it be from Carter Stevenson himself or perhaps some other larger Confederate force who might come later. Well, down in Chattanooga, that siege did not go very well. And Grant was able to, with the help of General Joe Hooker, coming all the way from the east, was able to open up what came to be called the Cracker Line, connecting a rail junction at Bridgeport, Alabama, over land to the east and breaking through Brown's Ferry into Chattanooga, and opening up a supply line, opening up food for the Union Army besieged at Chattanooga. This happening towards the end of October, was a sign that the Union Army was not, in fact, going to be starved out. Private Sam Watkins famously wrote in his memoirs on the Confederate First Tennessee that we were here to starve out the Union. Instead, we're starving out ourselves. This would be a perpetual problem, the lack of food, and particularly for the Confederate side. They were still in control of Missionary Ridge and of Lookout Mountain to the south of Chattanooga, but now there were supplies coming in. And Bragg was furious at this and demanded that Longstreet, who was still there with him, go and try to close down this supply line and launch an attack at Walhatchee Station west of Chattanooga. And this battle did not go well for him. And at this point, Bragg had decided he was done with Longstreet. Bragg, his poisonous relationships with all of his subordinates just kept getting worse. At one point, Jefferson Davis had come out to Chattanooga to try to solve disputes between Bragg and his subordinates, and came to basically double down his support for Bragg, and that demoralized many of the others. But nevertheless, that's the decision that was made. But Bragg decided at this point that he really wanted to be rid of Longstreet. The problem, of course, is if you're going to besiege a place, you need as many men to do it as possible. But he kind of already sensed that this siege was failing. It had already failed. And maybe the best thing to do is, A, get rid of Longstreet, get him out of his hair. And also, maybe if Longstreet could go up and, because he's still worried about Burnside up in Knoxville coming down to support Grant and Thomas, that maybe if Longstreet could go up and to Knoxville, and maybe he could go and defeat Burnside very quickly, maybe even drive him out of there and retake control of the railroad, the Georgia and East Tennessee and Virginia and East Tennessee Railroad, and force Burnside up to Kentucky, kind of gone from the realm. That maybe this would help if Longstreet could return quick enough that he could help to maybe surround Union forces. He knew that General Sherman was on the way, coming from Mississippi, and perhaps it would be possible for Longstreet to do this quick enough to get up to Knoxville and attack Burnside, defeat him, and then maybe come back in order to help to hold Chattanooga and protect the Confederate position there. Even though Sherman was on his way, this was a desperate gambit. It was a foolish gambit. There's not really, there's controversy to this day over why the heck Bragg did this, and it is a combination of reasons, as far as I can ascertain here. A combination of wanting to get rid of Longstreet, just simply did not like him. Also, probably wanted to gain control of that railroad, wanted to prevent Burnside from possibly coming to the aid of Grant, and potentially opening up a new front there. But most immediately, he was going to get rid of Longstreet. This meant a very kind of strange move because Carter Stevenson's men were still there. And so he essentially brought Carter Stevenson's men back from Sweetwater, Philadelphia area, back to Chattanooga, and then replaced them with Longstreet's larger corps. And these railroad cars were being heavily taxed. These railroad cars were in terrible shape. The food supply was getting smaller and smaller, and these troops under Longstreet were already running out of food. They heard of this place called Sweetwater, and they said, "What a beautiful sounding place." Literally, they said this. And in fact, Sweetwater, the Sweetwater Valley, the home of the beautiful Sweetwater cheese farm, if you've ever been there, it's a really great place. It's, what's that? Cheese Cows Wild. It's a great place. But Sweetwater was a destination. But in fact, there was a lot of food. But Carter Stevenson's men were getting that food and sending it to Bragg's men in Chattanooga. So by the time Longstreet got there, most of that food was gone. Oh well. Longstreet's men went east over towards Tyner Station, boarded the rail to get up there as quick as possible, and began their efforts to try to go after Burnside in Knoxville. Now, who was under command of Longstreet? Under him, and here I'll refer once again because I couldn't fit it all on one slide. The order of battle under Longstreet at this point was Lafayette McLaw's division. Under him was Joseph Kershaw's brigade, Wofford's brigade, although Wofford himself wasn't in charge, Benjamin Humphrey's brigade, Good Bryan's brigade, and then there was John Bell Hood's division. Although Hood was not there, it was commanded by Micah Jenkins. And under him was John Bratton, Jerome Robertson, Evander Law, and G.T. Anderson, and Henry Binning, along with artillery supported by E. Porter Alexander. And also Bushrod Johnson under Buckner's division would also come up and help. Cavalry under the command of Joe Wheeler, but also very importantly, a man named William T. Martin would be in charge of cavalry operations, along with Frank Armstrong. So these would be the main Confederate forces that were going to be on their way up to approach East Tennessee and approach Knoxville. All right. They move, actually, despite the lack of food, lack of supplies, they actually move up fairly quickly and reach around Loudon. And the Burnside has a decision to make. He is still waiting for these forts to be finished. And Burnside realizes that, and Grant is in communication with him, by the way. What Grant wants to do is for Burnside to keep Longstreet engaged, so he doesn't change his mind, and basically kind of slows him down. And so what happens essentially is that Burnside is going to come out of Knoxville, and he's going to stay out of Knoxville for a bit as far as Lenoir Station and try to sort of lure Longstreet in. But of course, he has to make sure that he can get back to Knoxville in time. At the same time, as Longstreet approaches Loudon, he wants to probe the outer defenses to see if there is another way in to threaten, perhaps to surround Burnside in Knoxville, and sends Joe Wheeler's cavalry across the Little Tennessee River through Blount County, through the back door, through Maryville and through Rockford, Tennessee, and actually defeats a kind of smaller cavalry unit and gets as close as Fort Dickerson, which is, of course, just south of the river, where it comes across a much larger infantry operation and decides that it's not worth it to push from there. If you ever climbed up Fort Dickerson, you can understand why. I don't know if there was a lot of kudzu there or those various stores, the CD store that's there. I don't know. But it is a very steep hill. It does, however, command a great view into Neyland Stadium, as well as the rest of Knoxville. So instead, Wheeler turns west across at Louisville and rejoins Bragg's men, or Longstreet's men, and that campaign is essentially over. But it's important to realize also that Longstreet had with him a bad map. And I found this map years ago, and I tried to find it again for this presentation and couldn't find it. But there was a confusion over the rivers leading into Knoxville. This map that he had in his possession mistook the French Broad River for the Little River. And the reason that's important, of course, is the French Broad goes east into Sevier County. And if you closed off the French Broad River, you would close off a potential supply operation into Burnside's men in Knoxville. The Little River simply goes through Blount County. It was not going to be as strategically important. Longstreet thus thought, until way too late, that he was in fact closing off, besieging Burnside and his Union troops inside Knoxville, because he thought he had closed off this river, and then discovered later on, nope, that's not accurate. This is complicated terrain, and if you don't know this terrain very well, it's easy to make these kinds of mistakes. Nevertheless, Burnside, he had set up his lure down at Lenoir Station. For his part, Longstreet crossed the river. He did not cross at Loudon. He crossed, there's a bend around a place called Huff's Ferry, just to the west, where Longstreet set up this pontoon bridge, as you can see up here, crossing the Tennessee River, and then eventually pushing in a northeasterly direction, and then heading over towards Lenoir Station, hoping to trap and defeat Burnside there. Burnside, this is now on, we're now at November the 15th, or the 15th of 1863. And Burnside is going to do something they're going to do over and over again, which is to fight essentially to a draw, but allowing for a safe retreat northeasterly towards Knoxville. Then there is a race on to the next destination, which is, of course, the Turkey Creek Shopping Center, where they're going to race to Campbell Station. And in this case, realizing that there are multiple roads to this key crossroads at Campbell Station. And it really is, it's the same road now. I mean, there's even a place called Loveville, which is, of course, Lovell Road now. There were multiple roads, the Kingston Road, which is the Kingston Pike, and then this Lenoir Road parallel to it. And knowing that Longstreet was trying to retreat, he was going to set up various lines, I think 4 different lines of defense. And the Confederates under Lafayette McLaws and Micah Jenkins and Evander Law were going to try to sort of squeeze Burnside so he could not retreat to the safety of Knoxville. And each time they would engage and there'd be crossfire, the Union would be somewhat outdated, somewhat outgunned, but they were positioned well, able to fend off any Confederate attack and then to retreat in a very orderly fashion. They kept doing this until they finally reached the junction at Campbell Station. And again, that's this date, November 16th of 1863, when this happens. Once once Burnside reaches the safety of Campbell Station, he now has an open road to make his way back to the confines, the friendly confines of the forts around Knoxville. But he still wants to, of course, hold off Burnside or Longstreet as much as possible, and will send out William Sanders to continue harassing operations. During these operations, Sanders, in fact, would be killed. And the outermost fort of the circle of the network of forts, which was first called Fort Loudon, was renamed Fort Sanders. Sanders was mortally wounded. He was wounded, and then he was taken to the Lamar House right down the street from here. It's now the Bijou Theater, and where he died. And he was very quickly seen as a martyr, as a true hero for the Union. But nevertheless, there were a lot of back and forth shooting down Kingston Pike during this part. The Longstreet set up shop at the Bleak House, and there's a tower out there where sharpshooters could gain access. Meanwhile, on Union forts, over 1,000, quite a bit of a distance, were shooting into that tower. And at one point, they actually blasted the tower and killed 3 Confederate sharpshooters who were in it. This was a standoff going on southwest of downtown Knoxville, or southwest of Knoxville, over the course of the next couple days. And Longstreet was desperately trying to figure out what is his way into Knoxville itself. He knows of these forts that are there. He is sending cavalry in both directions, probing for possible advances. One advance is to go north and around over towards the Tazewell Pike and to try to come in that way. That ends up not being particularly, there's enough Union cavalry to stave that off. So there's the other option of crossing the river and going under the south. Now here is a map here of Knoxville that's under siege at this point. And here, going down the Kingston Road here, is the most of Longstreet's men. And they are trying to besiege it, sending Confederate lines to the north around to the Tazewell Road, and then crossing the river here, and then occupying these hills from the south where they could bombard into, here is the main Union forts. You can see here Fort Sanders, which is the one that is the most obviously facing to the west, but there's other ones, Fort Byington, which is actually where the University of Tennessee campus is, and there's various other forts all around it. So Longstreet is trying to figure out what's the best way in. And that includes, of course, going south of the river, where there are, over the course of the next few days, a series of engagements where they're able to push back Union forces who are at Cherokee Heights here, and eventually, and Armstrong's Hill, and eventually setting up another stop at Fort Higley, where they're able to stop any further advancement, because as you get further east there, you get closer into being able to bombard into Knoxville itself. But none of this really amounted to much in terms of serious pressure upon Burnside's men. I mean, there was a harassment for sure. It was harassment and it was destruction to civilians. It was certainly something to keep an eye on. But it was obvious that the main force was going to go right for Fort Sanders, but I'm trying to find my thing here. There we go. I found the button. All right, right for Fort Sanders. That was clearly going to be the main action. And but still there were other probes too. There was even sending Wheeler off to the northwest to try to take Colonel Robert Byrd's forces at Kingston. This is one of these many smaller engagements that are going on all around here. Not huge battles here, but they're all part of trying to position Confederate troops to encircle and eventually attack Knoxville. Finally, they realized it was going to have to be Fort Sanders and the northwest bastion of Fort Sanders in particular. And so they laid in a proper siege, or as close to a proper siege as they could, the Confederates did, and used the spy glasses to observe what would be the best approach. And here was one of the other great mistakes of the preparation. They noticed that there were Union soldiers that were walking around in front of this fort, and it looked like this fort wasn't all that tall. You could see the ramparts, the parapets going up, but you could see people walking essentially right underneath it. So they figured, okay, if we just charge this fort and then charge right up this parapet, which didn't look particularly steep, you could then make your way into the fort and capture it. What they didn't realize was that the men who were walking outside the parapet were actually on planks. And these planks were over very, very deep ditches. And so the full range, if you fall into that ditch, you have about as much as 20 feet to reach all the way up out of the ditch and then to climb that parapet. And not knowing this, The Confederate Longstreet did not supply his men with scaling ladders or any other kinds of tools you would need to actually break through a siege. Didn't think it was necessary. Simply had not done the proper work of reconnaissance. Meanwhile, Poe and a guy named Samuel Benjamin, who seems to like to put himself at the center of everything in his writings, but he may have been important here, had the idea of using telegraph wire as tripwire to set it up outside of this ditch here, so that way as Confederates got close, they would then trip and fall and then would be potentially vulnerable. Well, as you reached the morning of the 28th, there was the plan for the assault, but then the weather was bad, and they said, let's wait till the 29th. Fortunately, it froze that night. And so in the early morning of the 29th of November, the assault columns of Longstreet gathered getting close to that ditch, and then pushed their way forward, not surprisingly, tripping over much of this telegraph wire, and much to their horror, falling into that ditch where it was filled with ice. And the Union forces at the top of Fort Sanders couldn't believe their luck, or maybe their good preparation, I guess is probably better to say, and noticed that these Confederates were essentially stuck in this icy ditch and had such easy targets. Over the course of 20 minutes would be, over 800 casualties, 129 killed on the Confederate side, including there were so many casualty options there that Union soldiers would remove the fuses from some of their shells, essentially throw them down as like grenades. After 20 minutes of this slaughter, the Longstreet, the Confederates, called off this assault. This Battle of Fort Sanders, the biggest battle here, was a complete disaster for the Confederacy, but in some ways it was doomed from the start. Where was Longstreet going to go with this? And after this battle, he retreats and tries to figure out what to do next. Meanwhile, down in Chattanooga, 4 days earlier, the Union had in fact broken out of Chattanooga, had taken Lookout Mountain, and much more importantly, had taken Missionary Ridge and driven Braxton Bragg into Georgia. That news had not yet arrived, but it was about to arrive in Knoxville. But before that, Grant sends Sherman up to Knoxville to relieve Burnside. He hears that Burnside is in trouble and needs support. Sherman makes his way up and actually sends a message, deliberately allows it to be captured, this letter, and sent to, captured by, another word, to be intercepted. So that way Longstreet would get the message, you need to get out of here because Sherman's coming. And don't even try a second assault. And it works. Longstreet does get this message, and after a few days of hanging out outside of outside of Knoxville, decides to retreat around to the north and to the east. At the same time, there is still that force under Orlando Wilcox that's up in Cumberland Gap that also wants to come down and squeeze and close off any possible retreat. They take Walker's Ford up in Union County and force basically the command of Longstreet to the east. General William T. Martin is going to be fighting a series of these cavalry battles. Longstreet is thus retreating to the east, and there's a question of how far he's going to go. He eventually reaches Bean Station, and at that point, Longstreet says, okay, I'm now in the open field, not near the fort anymore. For his part, Burnside has been replaced by John G. Foster. He's having a bout with diarrhea, actually, and which doesn't sound very fun. And he really wants to get out of service, and so Foster is now in charge. And Longstreet is still hanging out here in East Tennessee, and there's a question of what is he actually going to do at this point, okay? Sherman is, by this point, decided, you don't need me. Thank you, goodbye, I've got business in Georgia. And so he goes down. I don't know if the Vols will do as well in Georgia today as Sherman did, but we'll see in Athens. Anyway, so Sherman goes down, leaves Chattanooga, or leaves Knoxville, goes back to Chattanooga, and does in fact begin his plan for Atlanta, which is going to happen several months later. But in the meantime, Longstreet does try to sort of press back towards Knoxville, fights and briefly wins an engagement at Bean Station, but then just simply retreats south of the Holston River. There will be another engagement, which you'll hear more about on Wednesday if you come back, at Mossy Creek and at Hayes Ferry. And you would have a lot of these sort of small back and forth, mostly cavalry engagements. By this point, Samuel Sturgis takes command of Union cavalry, and Longstreet retreats sets up winter quarters at Russellville. And the story here is this is a freezing cold winter. I mean, record cold in late January into February, which is going to make it almost impossible to do any kind of military operations. Again, Longstreet's men are running, what the heck are we doing here? Okay, if we're not going to take Knoxville, what are we doing? Longstreet has these ideas that maybe he's going to launch a new heroic attack into Kentucky. At one point, he goes back to Richmond and meets with Robert E. Lee, and Lee says, that's not a bad idea, but I'm certainly not coming out west and joining you because Lee is essentially he's waiting for Grant in Central Virginia. Longstreet's kind of on his own and not really sure what he's going to do. After about a month or so, Longstreet, and again, there's a few more cavalry engagements like Fair Garden and Dandridge. Longstreet then retreats at the end of February further east to Greenville, and his men are wondering, are we just going to go back to Virginia? And the answer is yes, but not yet. And so this is what I mean with this strange long denouement. But eventually, yes, at the beginning of April, Longstreet does. He realizes he cannot rejoin Bragg down in Georgia. There's no way to get down there. He has held on to the railroad in Northeast Virginia and finally is ordered back to Virginia, where he joins Robert E. Lee for the critical Wilderness Battle and the Overland Campaign. At this point, Ulysses Grant, having done his work at Chattanooga, was placed in command of all forces in the East, and Grant and Lee would face off once and for all in the Eastern Theater. And so, what does this mean? What can we say about this whole Knoxville campaign, which is now effectively over? I think there are a couple lessons here that I think are important. One, the command structure, command problems inside the Confederate Army of Tennessee were fatal. The relationship that Bragg had with his subordinates was absolutely poisonous. Earl Hess wrote a really, really good book kind of reassessing Braxton Bragg called The Most Hated Man in the Confederacy. An excellent book where he essentially points out that, everybody blames Bragg alone for a lot of these things, but his subordinates were not exactly doing the right thing either. This was just an absolute disaster in many ways in the top command. And when you're trying to organize over this very large, expansive land, it's very difficult to you have to have trust. You have to know you're on the same page. It's like a long distance cat and mouse game. So you really have to have some semblance of trust. Grant and Burnside were in communication and were able to sort of plan this well, but not the case so much with Longstreet. The second thing is the mastery of complex terrain over this wide area. East Tennessee's terrain is complicated, and Burnside redeemed himself after his disaster at Fredericksburg. When he and his men were slaughtered by Longstreet, he flipped the script, and now it was his turn to crush Longstreet's men and in Knoxville. But a lot of it was his management, he and, of course, Orlando Poe with the forts. Burnside's proper management of the terrain around Knoxville helped to not only take Knoxville, but also to protect it, to hold on to it throughout the rest of this campaign. And of course, the last thing, supply lines matter enormously. Food was running out. This was devastating for civilians, both armies coming through, but the armies themselves. This is exactly what they worried about, what the Union Army worried about back in 1861. You come into East Tennessee in the wintertime, and there's not a lot of food. And so this is going to be very important. But the loyalties of the civilians matter a lot, too. The civilians were giving lots of intelligence about troop movements, and in some cases were giving false information to Confederates because of their own loyalties. And this would factor in. Some commanders, like Sherman, really didn't care much for it, but others found ways that they could use it to their advantage. Either way, the Knoxville campaign by April of 1864 was over. The Union was now in command of East Tennessee, with the exception of the extreme eastward region along the railroad heading in towards Saltville, Virginia. But for all intents and purposes, the war, from a larger military standpoint, was finished. Knoxville was now being protected by the 1st U.S. Colored Heavy Artillery, among other troops, and the rest of the Union command was now on its way down either to Georgia or to Virginia. Thank you.
Question?
Yes, questions?
If you had to choose between anybody who was helping the general, would you think Orlando Poe was probably the most valuable?
I think so, yeah. The construction of forts that he made was top notch, and I think later on he was put in charge of building lighthouses along Lake Michigan. I mean, he was a very, very well-respected engineer. And yeah, I mean, again, the terrain around here is complicated. It's not obvious. You can look at a map and figure some things out, but you have to be out in the field to know exact sight lines, and Poe figured that out very well. He understood the engineering of the angles of the parapets, the angles of the fort fire, and he, in fairly quick time, had created one of the most fortified cities in the world at that point, which turned out to be hugely important. But also, the movement of forces. I mean, Burnside's strategic retreat from Lenore Station to Campbell Station and back was also hugely important. But yeah, Poe definitely very important.
If Poe were an asset for Burnside, can you comment on Ledbetter's?
Yeah, Ledbetter. So Daniel Ledbetter, who was the Confederate in charge, started the process of building these fortifications, but they were never very complete. And part of the reason is they didn't feel it was necessary. I mean, they weren't envisioning an imminent Union attack. In some ways, the mountains themselves were the fort. If you guarded Cumberland Gap, that was more important than building elaborate forts around Knoxville. And so again, it's the geographic wide range of thinking you have to have in terms of if you're guarding the entrance into the valley itself, then you don't really need to worry about the city itself. Once you had enemy forces there, then of course you have to focus on the force. So I think, Ledbetter, of course, is known for cracking down on Union civilians after the bridge burner thing. But yeah, he was in charge of the fortifications, which were incomplete, but again, I don't think they needed to be much bigger than that, because the mountains themselves were the fort for all intents and purposes.
Yes, sir. Dr. John Clark, Saltville, Virginia. Excellent
Thank you.
presentation. John McKenna Floyd is an ancestral relative of mine. Died in Abingdon, 120 miles
Yeah.
from Virginia, 1863. One of the reasons he skedaddled from Fort Donelson, he was Secretary of War under
Yes.
James McKenna,
And he would be tried for treason.
and he would be afraid to be tried for
Yep.
treason. The way he got down here, he was exiled. He was a Virginia governor.
Yep.
He and Henry Wise were sent into West Virginia to try to hold it. Those two hated each other.
Yeah.
They wouldn't cooperate. That professor at Virginia Tech said if those two had shot each other, West Virginia would still be part of Virginia.
Yeah. Yeah, Floyd. So Floyd is your direct ancestor of yours?
Ancestral, of course.
Oh wow, it's amazing. John Floyd. John Floyd and Gideon Pillow both did not exactly acquit themselves very well at Fort Donelson. And maybe you know why Floyd ordered his men back into the ditches again. I never quite understood what he was thinking there. Do you know at Fort Donelson? Nobody.
He died of stomach cancer in Abingdon, Virginia, in 1863. I knew that.
Yeah. So I guess we'll never know then. Yeah. Interesting.
The Battle of Chickamauga was obviously a tactical defeat for the Union.
Correct.
But strategically, the end result of all these campaigns, abandoning Knoxville, basically abandoning Chattanooga, was a strategic disaster because they couldn't really defend that western
That's right.
onslaught.
That's exactly
from
right.
Sherman. So
Right.
I read a lot about Chickamauga being a Confederate victory,
Yeah.
but it seems to me it really covers the real.
You just said it exactly right. It was a tactical victory, but a strategic defeat. And fellow Confederates, Nathan Bedford Forrest, among them, right away said, this if we don't destroy them before they get into Chattanooga, then this was all for nothing. And a lot of others did. In fact, Bragg was. A lot of people were complaining that you defeated them, you allowed the Union to limp into Chattanooga, and now you've got no plan to do it at this point. And of course, when Bragg was finally beaten at Missionary Ridge, he was fired and replaced by Joseph Johnston. But yeah, you're exactly right. It was a tactical victory for the Confederates, but it didn't amount to anything. And so it was strategically, the whole thing comes together, including with the Knoxville story, that it was a Union victory. Yeah.
Could you speak a little bit about the activity, both Union and Confederate, in the vicinity of cross-river ferry points between Knox and Blount County? I'm primarily interested in Louisville.
Yeah. So there was Wheeler's men would cross at Louisville. Would cross there on November. I think it was actually the 16th. It was actually this date, I think. Also, because it was after trying to pass Rockford and Stock Creek, making our way up to Fort Dickerson area, and then turning west when they realized they couldn't get through there. The main ferry, and also when Sherman comes up as relief mission, he sort of camps up. He comes right through Maryville at one point, and in fact, he occupies where the Maryville College campus, well, which was downtown at that point. The most important ferry crossing for militarily was further down, was by Loudon, was Huff's Ferry, because that's where Longstreet crosses. But there was certainly a lot of cat and mouse game along the bends of the river there to possibly cross. The Confederates, of course, do cross again, but much closer to Knoxville when they try to take Armstrong Hill. They take the heights south of Knoxville. But around Louisville, I think the most important crossing that happens there is when Wheeler crosses. Now there is another interesting crossing too around Morganton. When Sherman comes up in his relief mission, he has to cross the Little Tennessee River, and he needs a pontoon bridge, and they don't have supplies to do it. They literally dismantled the town of Morganton. They take it and use it as building materials in order to build a pontoon bridge. Morganton doesn't exist anymore. In Blount County, there's a Morganton Road, but you're like, where's Morganton? Oh, well, Sherman took it. It's gone. It turned into a bridge. There's now the town of Greenback, which is pretty much right near there, a railroad town built later. But yeah, so that's, the ferry crossing, there may have been some other crossings there, but it was never beyond Wheeler crossing back over in Louisville. I don't think there was any other particularly strategic crossings.